everyone, welcome back to the Plantery. This is Dr. Jared, and today I'm going to be talking with you about how we start seeds here at Stephen F. Austin State University. For us, whenever we're thinking about starting seeds and sharing information about it, we want to come at this from a home gardener or a small school perspective. And so a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking to you about today aren't really done on a large commercial basis, but some of the thinking that's gone into this you can definitely apply to larger growing operations. Because when we're sowing seeds, one of the things that we want to keep in mind is we want these young plant propagules to germinate and grow as well as they possibly can. Because if we're putting effort into starting plants, we want to then make sure that they're successful early on, so that then when we get ready to plant them out, they're also going to grow great. So whenever you're thinking about seed starting success, one of the things that we've learned about being efficient is really trying to standardize things, standardize the process, because working with over 100 students within a semester and doing this over multiple years, you really want to try to reduce confusion as much as you possibly can while also maximizing the success that you have with starting seeds. So one of the ways that we've been able to standardize things in production of starting seeds here is that we really only start seeds in a couple of small size containers. One way that we start seeds, of course, is using some of these trays. So these are what we refer to as germination trays. They are inserts that are in a web flat for bottom support. And whenever you're looking for trays, if you want to find your own, they have both circular and square versions of these cells. Personally, I prefer the square versions over the circular because if you have the same diameter cell hole, if you have a square hole versus a circular hole, you're actually going to get a little bit more growing space because you occupy a little bit more of that empty space between the cells. So you can get somewhere around 20 to 25% more growing space just by shifting the shape of the cell that you're going to be sowing your seeds into. So again, this is what we refer to as like a germination tray. And again, we've standardized that language with students. So if we say sow these seeds in a germination tray, they know what we're talking about. Over here, we also have what we call a 3-inch pot. And so what we'll do is we'll call these a 3-inch pot tray or an 18 3-inch pot tray, because these are technically the 3.5 inches, but we're not going to get too picky this morning about that. But these fit very nicely, again, in one of these bottom web flat supports. And so we can put 18 in here and to get seeds started off. So one of the questions we want to ask as we're starting seeds are, what types of seeds are we growing? Because we plant different seeds in these different standardized containers. So in these small cells, a lot of times what we'll do is we will plant plants that are tough and can take a lot, or plants that you want to plant on a very close, dense spacing. So examples of this, things we plant on close, dense spacing, are things like lettuce. We start a lot of lettuce in here, as well as kohlrabi as well too as an edible. But we also start basil. You know, basil transplants very, very well. It'll actually form roots along the stem and has those adventitious roots that even if you plant it a little bit deeper into the soil, it'll kind of root off there. And then we also start a lot of our cut flowers in here too, because again, we tend to plant those along close, dense spacing. So our zinnias, a lot of times we'll get started in here, gomphrena, other ones as well too. Now for our larger 3-inch pots, what we'll often do is we will start seeds like a lot of our brassicas, our cabbages, our broccolis, our kohlrabi, Brussels sprouts, kale. We start these in these 3-inch pots because they tend to get pot bound very quickly. And so remember, we're coming at this from a school garden perspective. So let's say that we schedule these seeds to be planted out the first week of March, and the first week of March comes and it's very wet, the day of the lab class activity that we're going to be planting. Well, that means that these pots and plants may be sitting on the bench for another extra week. So starting the brassicas like the cabbages and broccolis in these cells gives us a little bit more of a flex time of getting it out into the garden. If we start them in here and we miss them a week or they stay too long in here, they may get too root bound, which means that the roots grow too thickly. They're wanting to expand out in the cell, and so they get too contracted. And so we prefer to start those in these. We also sow tomato seeds directly in here. You can start plants like tomatoes in these germination trays and then pot them up into these 3-inch pots. But for us, again, because we're a school garden and students are only here on like a once a week, twice a week basis with classes, sometimes we want to eliminate that extra labor step that we go through. And I'll talk about a trick that we use here in just a second to make sure we get even germination in these pots. Okay, so I've talked about thinking through how you want to decide which plants you're planting into things. You know, lettuce, other herbs, cut flowers in these, cabbages, a lot of our tomatoes and peppers go into these larger ones as well too. Again, just trying to improve growth on those. The other thing to keep in mind too is that always watch your cell size, because the greater the cell size, the more vigorous a plant a lot of times you're going to have too. Just again, because that plant may have root bounding that's occurring for it growing in there. All right, so moving along, whenever we then want to fill up our trays, we've also standardized our growing substrate that we're using. And so we have two different types of growing substrate that we use here in the plantery. We have this type of substrate here, which this is called germination substrate. Again, we've just standardized the name. We get this from a variety of different blenders. But germination substrate is very fluffy. It's very airy. It's like having chocolate cake mix. You know, you can just crumble it apart and it falls apart in your hands. Part of the reason it is so nice and fluffy is because we have had this substrate sifted through. They actually sift this substrate through to remove a lot of the thicker parts of it, and then they'll also add vermiculite, which helps to improve porosity and water moving through that substrate. So that's germination substrate that we use. We also use potting substrate, and potting substrate here mainly goes into these 3-inch pots. And so you can see here potting substrate is a little bit more coarse. I compare this to, you know, like if you took a brownie mix and you had some chocolate chips or something in it. So it's going to have a nice crumbly texture, but as you crumble it, you're going to feel some bark pieces that they add to sort of give the mix a little bit of a bulk, as well as you usually notice that there's some white particles in there too, and that's perlite. It's expanded rock that helps to, again, add more porosity and helps to improve water movement and airflow into that substrate. So that's the only two types of growing media that we use here. Again, if you have other plants that you're growing like orchids or succulents or cacti, you may have some other substrates, but really us trying to standardize these types of substrates, again, eliminates confusion whenever students come in here and start sowing plants for lab. The reason that we use these two different types of substrates is because, again, we use different substrates for the different cells. So the germination substrate corresponds with the germination cell tray that we have, and then the potting substrate corresponds with the pots that we have. We not only use potting substrate in 3-inch pots, we also use it in gallons, larger containers as well too, that we are potting up. Part of the reason we use different substrates for different cells is because this germination substrate is really good at holding water, but also allowing airspace through. But it works much better in these smaller cells where water management and airspace management is much more important. Here with these larger cells, you want a little bit more porosity, because if you put this germination substrate into a larger pot, it typically just holds water too effectively, and it can decrease the amount of oxygen that you have available for those seeds to germinate. So we like to use this potting substrate here in these larger pots. And this can be something that, you know, really impacts the success of your seeds. In fact, I've been to schools before where if you're not using the right substrate, you get hardly any seed germination. The minute they switch and buy one of these substrates like we buy, then that means that they're going to have a lot more success. So again, I advise you look at your local garden center and talk to them about getting good germination substrate or good potting substrate for planting up your plants. A lot of times whenever you buy these products, you're going to get better bang for your buck if you spend a little bit more money on getting better quality. I will also say this too, in other parts of the country, there's definitely more sustainable options as well. about getting substrates. A lot of people are looking at using locally sourced materials or buying organic substrates, and so if you've got that option available to you, go for it, definitely. Okay, so now what we want to do is we want to start filling up these trays for planting. So what I like to do on these germination trays is just kind of come in here and lightly start fluffing the media in. Again, if you're a larger growing operation, a lot of times they'll have conveyor belts where they'll just put these trays on and they will automatically fill them up as they move down the conveyor belt. But for us doing it here at a school garden like the plantery, we want to make sure that we're filling these things up effectively by hand, because for us, you know, we don't have thousands of dollars to go out and buy a giant conveyor belt system. So for us, hand filling does great. It also works great for you home gardeners out there too. This is how I sow seeds at my house. So I feel like I've got enough substrate here on this tray, so I'm able to kind of go through. Notice that what I'm doing is I'm just filling in all the cells effectively as well as I can, and then I'm just going to roll this tub. We put our substrate in these roller tubs to very effectively allow us to move the substrate around to different parts of the greenhouse. These are just trash cans on wheels that you can get at a local hardware store. And so I've now got this tray filled up fairly effectively. You can see here, nice clean surface. You really have to watch your corners to make sure that you get enough substrate in them. The other thing too, a lot of times I'll do after I fill a tray is I'll drop it from a height of about 4 inches just to set the density. And so what this does is this lets me see, do I have any cells where maybe a little bit of an air pocket formed, and once I water it, it's going to settle that down, and suddenly I'm going to have a couple of cells in here that don't have as much substrate in it. So you can see here on this corner, it dropped down just a little bit. So I'm just going to top that up a little bit to make sure that I've got a good, even tray surface here for sowing my seeds. So again, that's our germination tray. Okay, now that we've filled our germination substrate tray, let's go ahead and start filling our 3-inch pot tray. Again, we're using potting substrate to fill this tray up with. So I just start filling it up into the individual cells. So again, filling the tray like this is very efficient using one of these scoops because you can fill multiple pots at once. In fact, sometimes what we'll do is we'll line this whole table out here with trays, and we will get a bag of substrate that we've bought, and we will open that bag up and just basically pour it in there on top of those trays and just move it around like I'm doing here to very effectively spread this substrate out, filling in all the pots. So I'm almost done here. Again, I'm being careful to watch my corners. The corners you usually have to watch because they tend to get a little bit less in here. So now what I'm going to do is just kind of move my hands along, making sure that all these pots are getting good and filled up with the growing substrate. And again, I can very easily move this over so that if I need to scoop off any extra to save it, because you know we want to save this precious resource that we have. So now I've got that tray nice and full. And again, I do something similar, drop it from a height of about 3 or 4 inches, just to check everything looks good. Part of the reason I drop it again is because if you have different amounts of substrate in different cells, they can dry out faster or slower depending upon how much is in there. So if you've got one pot that's 90% full and another one that's 80, well, that 81 may dry out faster. It may have a harder time getting started too because that substrate sunk down a little bit, and those seeds may be staying a little bit too wet. So making sure that we're filling the tray as consistently as we possibly can really helps us make sure that we're having good success with starting our seeds. So whether it's germination trays or potting trays, we really try to be consistent about how much substrate we put in each pot. The other thing that I will tell you to do too is to never do this. So some people think, and I'm going to pull off a separate pot here, some people think that the correct way to fill a pot after you fill it up is to come along and compress the substrate down into the pot like this. And I've even seen growing operations. I've heard of growing operations who've done this, where what they'll do is they'll compact it in there to get as much substrate as you possibly can into this pot. And then they'll come along and they'll fill up some more, and then they'll pack it some more. This is a no-no. Do not do this. And part of the reason that we do not do this is because Not only does this pot contain substrate that the plant's going to grow into, but it also contains pore space. It contains open areas in between the particles in here. And those open areas are very important to make sure that the roots are able to get air access in there, as well as to have channels for water to flow through. And so if we compress this soil down into this pot, we're removing a lot of that pore space that we have in this pot for effective growth. So don't be compressing the trays, compressing the pots. You instead fill it up, lightly drop it. That'll set the density and let you see if you've got any spots where you had an airspace occur. The other thing too that I'd like to talk about with substrates is that most of these substrates come with what's called a starter fertilizer charge. Whether you're using a conventional substrate or organic substrate, they'll put just a little bit of fertilizer in there. It's just enough usually to get those seedlings started, but once you get them growing, you usually will then want to start applying your own fertilizer that you have available to you. Now that we have effectively filled up our germination tray and our potting tray, now we're going to water them in. Whenever I'm watering these trays in, I really like to use a watering wand with a nice fine water breaker on the end. You can buy different heads for these that have different hole sizes. Some hole sizes, of course, a little bit larger. Those are great if you're out watering things out in the garden. But for seedlings, I prefer a much more finer seed water breaker head, so that way you're able to get that fine mist of water going onto the trays. So whenever I water the trays in, I make sure that I'm not very close to the top of the substrate, because I don't want that substrate, as I put water pressure on it, to be coming out of there, to be sort of being blasted out of there, because again, we want to make sure that that soil is staying there as much as possible. So what I like to do is kind of water high and then just go gently back and forth across the trays to help that get wetted in. So you can see here, I'm just going back and forth across the trays. If your substrate's a little dry, it may take a little while for that substrate to soak it up. So that can be helpful if you come through maybe a day before you're planting or a day before you have your class lab activity, and just put a little bit of water in there and mix it in. But that should do the trick. I've gone high over them about 5 times or so to make sure that they've got enough water. You can also see that the water is trickling down through those cells. So I like to water the plants in before I sow the seeds, because that just helps me minimize any type of movement of the seeds after I've planted them. If you plant the seeds and then water them afterwards, you could have some settling of the substrate. The seeds may jump from one cell to another. We've had that happen before. So that's just something to keep in mind as you're going through and sowing your seeds, to make sure that you water them before. The other thing too is that whenever you're thinking about the factors of seed germination, water is what really kickstarts this process. So if you're making sure that your substrate is moist to start with, that's going to ensure that your seeds have a better chance of success getting going. Okay, now that we've watered our seed trays in, next we want to start thinking about now finally getting to the exciting step, sowing our seeds. So there's a couple of things that we want to keep in mind here too. Okay, first, choosing the seeds that you're going to be sowing. I always recommend, buy your seeds earlier than you think you're going to be using them, because a lot of times when seed companies get their mass orders in January, February, and March, they get overloaded. And so you may be a little delayed getting your seeds if you're buying seeds at this time of the year. What I like to do is keep a running list of things that I want to purchase, and then as soon as the holidays come, go ahead and get that seed order in. A lot of times November, December are great times to get those seed orders in, because seed companies are restocking their shelves of supply, and then you're getting it in a little bit ahead of time before those orders start coming in for the spring. So whenever we get our seeds in, today I'm going to be doing a demonstration with lettuce red sails. Lettuce red sails is a great variety of lettuce that we grow here at the plantery. It's an All-American Selections winner. In fact, it won the year of my birthday, 1985. So this, of course, is a great, reliable one that we grow here. It's got a beautiful bronze red foliage to the leaf, and we're going to be sowing this today. So as I'm going along sowing this lettuce, there's a couple of things that I need to keep in mind. One is labeling the trays. Labeling the trays is very, very important, because As far as I've checked, plants can't talk to us. Now that doesn't mean that I don't try to talk to them, but so far plants can't tell us I'm lettuce red sales. And so that's why it's very important for us to have labels written on there. And we don't just use one label per tray. A lot of times what we'll do is we'll actually put two labels at either ends of the tray, because if one label gets knocked out, which sometimes does happen during production, you've now lost the identity of that plant. And so a lot of times we'll put two labels on separate ends of the tray. That way, in case one gets lost, you still got a backup. The other thing too is that when we're writing on labels, always use pencil, because if you use something like an ink pen or a Sharpie, that can fade very quickly. There are wax pencils and things out there as well too that I've heard good things from colleagues for their success in staying on there long periods of times, but I'm just like the old-fashioned good old pencil. Most students have them, so you can have them pull it out. The other thing too is we keep a supply of pencils here at the plantry too, so that way you can have those available for students to use. So once we get ready to sow our seeds, we have two different approaches whenever we're sowing seeds in the germination trays versus the potting trays. In the germination trays, we try our best to only sow one seed per cell. And the reason we do this is because these cells are very, very small. And so if you just willy-nilly sow a handful of seeds or something in a cell and you get 5, 10 germinate out of there, well, you have two options. One option is that you can then take that cell, break it apart, and then plant those individual seedlings in different cells. But again, that's going to be extra labor for you and for people who may not be very advanced in transplanting plants. They may get to it too long. So if you have a lot of seedlings growing next to each other in close proximity, they may oftentimes stretch because they're trying to reach more light, and growing too close, you've got too much competition. The other option is what we do here. We just thin them out and toss the scraps, or students take home sprouts or something. So there's a couple different ways where, if you accidentally get 2 or 3 different plants in here, you can either transplant it to a different cell or just go through and thin it. But this one is very important that we try and strive to sow one seed per cell in this germination tray. Again, just because of the density of seeds that we have in this area. Now, for the pots, the 3.5-inch pots that we use, what we do is we actually sow 2 seeds per pot. And we do this very strategically. We'll sow one seed here, and we'll sow one seed off a little bit to the other side too. We don't sow them both directly in the middle. The reason we do this is because a lot of times these germination trays we're keeping in-house. We don't sell these trays to anyone. Yes, we get 288s and 144 cell trays from companies. That's their job, to sell us small transplants. But for us, using these 72 cell germination trays, we're using these in-house. So if cells in here don't germinate very effectively, it's no big deal. For these 3.5-inch pots, a lot of times we sell these to customers. And so if we sow one seed per cell, that means that if we have, let's say, even 90% germination, that means we may have 2 pots in here where we didn't have germination occurring in that pot. So for us, that's part of the reason why we sow 2 seeds per pot, because that helps us ensure we've got a backup. That if we do have a pot where we don't have germination, we've got a backup plant in it. And in the rare instance, let's say we get a batch of seed where we don't have very good germination. Maybe instead of being 95%, it's 60%, which sometimes you do get that. We have some backups in the tray that then we can transplant to other cells. Because if we come through this and now re-sow the crop, we have to get the seeds out of the fridge. We have to then go in the greenhouse, figure out which seeds are in which tray. So this is a really quick, simple way that students, if you're growing this in a school garden or a home garden, can just make sure you've got a backup. The other benefit too is that it may be 10 days before you realize that you've got some absent holes in these trays. And so having them sown all on the same date, just transplanting an extra one to an empty pot, allows you to make sure you're staying on time. And again, we want that standardized uniformity of the crop. If we have someone come by this tray, they're not going to be happy if all the plants look great and then we've got 3 that are a little smaller, shorter. So we're going to have to figure out something to do in that instance. Again, having these backups in here really prevents us from having those occurrences. Okay, so whenever I get ready to sow seeds, Again, we've got water, which of course seeds need to be able to germinate. The other thing to keep in mind whenever you're germinating seeds is temperature. You've got to check the temperature ranges that your seeds need to be able to effectively germinate, because while moisture is really the thing that primes seed germination, gets it going, temperature is what really helps to control whether or not your enzyme activity, your biological growth of that seed is going to start. Because, for example, we sowed corn salad seeds years ago at the end of August, and they sat there for a month because it was in the 80s and 90s every day. The first day that we got a nice cold front come through, they got rained on out in the garden. Well, it cooled things down, and the next thing we know, we have corn salad seeds popping up. It's a little nice edible green plant that people like to throw in salads in the winter. And so some plants require cooler temperatures to be able to germinate. Other plants require warmer temperatures to germinate, like peppers. A lot of times your peppers have an optimum seed germination of somewhere around 75 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. So if you're starting seeds on a windowsill in the spring, let's say you want to start some peppers on a windowsill early in March and it's still cool outside, it's probably going to be cool on the window. So even if your house is set at 72 degrees, 75 degrees, that windowsill may be somewhere around 68, 65. So that means that those pepper seeds may take a lot longer to germinate. So just as you're sowing your seeds, check and make sure that you know the temperature ranges they need to germinate. So besides water and temperature, the third thing seeds need to be able to germinate and grow effectively is oxygen. Those are the three things right there that all seeds absolutely need. And so when we're thinking about oxygen, our substrates, again, because we're using these nice fluffy substrates, we're using the right substrate in the right tray, oxygen is usually not a big issue for us. It only becomes an issue if you're using a substrate which has too many fine particles in it and you don't get a lot of that pore space in between to allow the air and moisture to move through that substrate. Now, part of the reason that I chose lettuce red cells to sow today is because some seeds out there have dormancy mechanisms which control whether or not they germinate. The majority of the vegetable and cut flower annual seeds that we sow don't have these. A lot of these have actually been bred out as we've domesticated these crops over thousands of years. But the reason I chose lettuce is because lettuce actually responds to the presence of light. Lettuce seeds are actually able to sense whether or not they have red light shining on them or not. And it's not, like when you look up the sun, it's, a nice golden white light coming. But again, all the colors are in there. And really what lettuce seeds are perceiving is whether or not they have that red light shining on them. And so whenever I sow lettuce seeds, a lot of times I'll just make a dimple in the top of the substrate and then sow that seed in there. And then I won't even really cover it up. I may put some light paper on it, paper towels on it. Here, of course, we have the mist benches as well too, but I may just barely close that gap. For other seeds like our cabbages, our broccolis, our tomatoes, our peppers, a lot of the things that we start in these cells, a lot of times we will make a dimple into the substrate either using our finger. Pencils are great too. If you get really, really efficient, one of the things you can do is you can make a board that has perfectly placed screws drilled into it that you can just put down on top of that, or pegboards that you can put down on top of this, and then they make perfectly indented holes to the right depth, and then you can use that as a template for all of your trays getting things started. So you can make this process as efficient as you'd like to. But for us, a lot of times, again, because we're working with students, just hand sowing the seeds out is effective for us. So once we make those holes for the other plants besides lettuce, like cabbages or tomatoes, we usually make the hole about 2 to 3 times the width of the seed. And so on average, we're sowing seeds somewhere around 1/4 to 1/2 inch deep. The majority of our seeds that we sow here are fairly small. It's only rare that we would get a larger seed, and like let's say a bean, that we would want to plant a little bit deeper. And to be honest with you, most of the time beans and squashes and stuff, we're direct sowing those directly into the garden instead. But if you'd like to sow some deeper seeds or larger seeds, you can just sow them a little bit deeper. Again, that 2 to 3 times the width of the seed is a good average to consider when you're sowing it. Okay, so I've now got a pencil to get ready to sow my seeds. I've also written my plant label on here as well too. Whenever you're writing things on plant labels, again, like I mentioned earlier, make sure you've got a pencil because ink will run. But what I write on here is a couple of things. I write the crop or the species name. So for example, lettuce, I wrote that on here. If you want to get more technical in teaching nomenclature to your students, definitely go the scientific name route like Lactuca sativa. I also write the cultivar name on here, red sales as well too. Now, one of the things that I teach students in class is how to correctly write a scientific name, how to capitalize it, italicize it. On labels, we modify that ever so slightly to say we write everything in caps. And part of the reason we write everything in caps is because we want to be able to easily read this from a distance. If people start writing things in lowercase, it can get lost sometimes. So students know how to write scientific names of plants correctly, but then on our labels, we tend to write things in all caps. The other thing too that we'll have them write is their name, who started it. If you're doing this at home, you know it's you or your spouse or kids. So your kids may even want to claim their own trays. So again, you can write a person's name on there. The other thing that's very important for us to write on there is the date that we've sown it. And for us, I prefer the format of day, month, year written out. So we write today's January 14th, so we'd write 14th January 2022. And so that way we have a definite date. You can keep these labels as you move plants on up or out into the garden so that they're like little micro notes of things. So you can write the date that you planted it. If you decide to go on and start seeds that are more specialized, like houseplants or interesting perennials, you can also make notes about when you potted them on, planted them out eventually into the garden. It's also nice to have a running notebook as well too that has written down all the seeds that you've been growing so that you can make some notes in your propagation notebook to keep track of things. Having that notebook really helps you see what you were successful with last year, and if you sowed seeds in one type of substrate or sowed seeds at one time of year and they didn't grow well, maybe try a different type of year or different conditions. Some seeds, like I talked about with lettuce, have dormancy mechanisms. As we'll talk about later on in another video, some native perennial seeds and some trees and shrubs actually have to go through a chilling dormancy. So you have to actually expose those seeds to moist, cool conditions to help them overcome some of those dormancy mechanisms. Other seeds even have to be scarified on the outside, like one of our favorites, Texas bluebonnets. Usually have to go in and scarify the outside of that with either nail clippers or a sandpaper or something. So I have now got my two labels on either ends. I have my pencil, and so I can go along and now make the little dimples into the substrate. If you want to use fingers, it's nice because then you can kind of go along and do two fingers at once. So I'm just going through and barely making some dimples in here. Don't worry about your fingers getting a little dirty. We're gardeners, we're used to that. Over here I can do the same thing, just go along and make dimples in that substrate. So now I've got all those little dimples made. Okay, now that I've made my dimples in the tops of the trays, I pour some seed out in my hand. Now again, I want to say you can become more efficient with this as you get more practice. So one way that I like to sow seeds is I actually make a crease in the seed packet and I'll go along and just tap the seeds in. For larger seeds, of course, it's a little bit easier, or if you're not too worried about having to come through and thin things out, this is a very fast way of going through and doing it. Other seeds I'll just count out by hand, so I'll go through here and I will just individually put a single seed in each one of these cells as best that I possibly can. Again, we can come through and thin them out later in case we get too many in here. Like I said earlier with covering them up, lettuce, I usually will just maybe do a light dusting or maybe shake the tray a little bit after I sow it because lettuce needs light to be able to germinate. But most of the other seeds I can then come through and do a top dressing of either the germination or the potting substrate at the very end. So that'll just help to cover those little dimples where I made them into the substrate. So in the germination tray, I'm sowing again one seed per cell, but then whenever I come over here for the potting substrate, I would do 2 seeds per cell, again, based on what I said earlier about having that backup seed to make sure that you've got a solid tray of seeds ready to grow. Okay. Now that I have sown seeds in both of these trays here, we're now ready for the next step, which is, of course, keeping those seeds moist. We've already watered the trays in well outside. And so now our goal is to keep these trays moist, not overly wet, but moist until we are able to see those radicals emerge from the seed coat and growth begin. So there's a couple different ways that you can do this. One is that, if you're a homeowner, you can probably water the seeds once in the morning, once in the afternoon after you get home, before you go to work, after you get home from work. And that should probably do you pretty good at effectively keeping them moist. In fact, sometimes what I like to do is on the weekends, sow seeds first thing on Saturday morning. That way you're able to water them in Saturday morning, Saturday through the day, Saturday evening, Sunday morning, Saturday afternoon, Saturday evening if you need to. You've now provided those seeds with ample moisture for about 24 to 36 hours. For most of our vegetable crops, that's usually adequate enough to get them growing, as well as cut flower crops too. However, depending on your time of the year, you may want to help keep seeds more moist, or you may be more labor strained because you may have 50 or 100 trays. So there's a couple of other ways you can do that. If you have crops that are not sensitive to light for germination, like again our cabbages, tomatoes, you can cover them with cardboard trays or something. You just want to watch your labels to make sure that you fold them down, they don't pop out. But cardboard, even pieces of wood, floating row cover, old sheets as well are great as well too for helping to hold that moisture in. I've even been to growing operations before where they just cover trays up with newspaper to help hold that moisture in. Newspaper is great, and sheets are great because they actually allow light through. As you get more sophisticated, and especially for those of you out there who have a school garden, you may want to go to what we call an intermittent mist system, where you put it into a chamber where you have mist nozzles set up to go off at specific intervals throughout the day. You can achieve this a couple different ways. You can actually go out and buy a timer at your local garden center that you can hook up to hoses so that way you can turn on those with an irrigation mist system and they spray. I've even had colleagues who have gone out and bought those fogger misters that you put up on a patio and hook those up and have those spray over plants over a period of time. Or you can get much more elaborate like we have here, which is of course to go ahead and buy a full-on intermittent mist system with all the appropriate solenoids, time clocks, and then also your mist nozzles and emitters and PVC piping. So I'll leave that choice up to you. So once we get these seeds growing and germinating, we will then move them out of that mist as soon as we see, usually I tell students, especially for a lot of our vegetable crops, once you see about 50% of emergence within that tray, go ahead and move it out. Most of our seed crops that we grow, again, vegetables, cut flowers, come from seed companies that usually we have pretty good germination rates for. Usually we're 90% or higher. So if you see 50% germinate in the tray, you want to go ahead and move them out to start exposing them to ambient conditions out of that moist environment. Because if you leave seeds too long either under cardboard or if you leave seeds too long in mist, they're not going to grow well. Underneath cardboard, they can't get light, right? And so we want to make sure that they're able to get adequate light. If you leave seeds too long in mist, they're not able to adequately grow and respond to environmental conditions. It's kind of like you're babying them too much. So we want to get them out, getting them exposed to the air movement, less relative humidity, etc. And then the other thing to think about too after you move them out is, again, going back to that starter charge fertilizer. Whether you want to go the conventional organic route, start applying fertilizers once you see emergence, because that starter charge is in there to help kickstart germination, just to provide a little bit as they start growing. But because of the fact that you've had them in a wet environment, probably leaching some fertilizer nutrients out, you want to start working on replenishing them. So then what we'll do is we'll grow the plants on for how many ever weeks. Usually in these germination trays, plants need to only stay in there about 3 to 4 weeks. Any longer than that, they can start getting root bound. Over here in our 3-inch pots, we have a little bit more leeway where we can start planting some vigorous plants within about 3 to 4 weeks if it's especially an active, hot time of the year where plants are really growing. Other plants, other times of the year, you may be able to push it back to even 4, 5, 6, maybe even 7 weeks as well too. But we don't like to keep plants in here any longer than 2 months. Again, if they stay in here too long, they can become root bound. So we either plant them out somewhere, we sell them here in our garden markets, or we may pot this up. Like, let's say I was starting something like let's say that you wanted to sow some maple seeds in these. Well, maybe I would then take those maple seedlings and pot them up into larger containers. So that's an option too. We also always get questions. This is kind of the last step after you get everything going, after you planted these things out. Like, what do you now do with your trays and pots that you have left behind? That's a great question. What we do is we actually reuse them as best we can, because plastic is something that we don't want just willy-nilly going into landfills, and so we will reuse these trays. We don't really have any issues with fungal diseases breaking out. If you do start running into disease problems, you can always buy an extra trash can, fill it with some Clorox, and then dump those trays in there, let them set for a couple of days in a dilute Clorox blend, and that'll usually be really good for sanitizing anything that may have been in there. So especially if you've got issues like mealybugs, which can be very persistent, or maybe fungal diseases, you may want to do more sanitation. We do sanitation here, and we do sometimes have to replenish our stock because, if we're selling pots like these that are going out the door to homeowners in the local East Texas area, we're going to have to buy more pots. But again, I encourage you to think sustainably. There are other trays out there too that you can buy that are very rigid and that don't break very easily, that you can use to grow in. And then also think about using other sustainable pots like coconut fibers as well. As we're growing plants, we want to do this as sustainably as we most possibly can. So I want to thank y'all for watching today and learning more about how we start seeds here in the plantery. I really hope that this video has been good information about helping you be successful this spring, or really any time of the year as you're starting and sowing seeds. And a friendly reminder, come see us here at the plantery at SFA. We've got lots of great projects that we're growing, and we can't wait to see you. Until next time, keep growing.